Hey everybody, this is Will Miles with Read and Reaction, going over another one of the articles over there at www.readandreaction.com. Appreciate everybody's support. These seem to have been pretty successful. Everybody seems to like being able to watch me read my articles on YouTube. Certainly we'll have a stand up and holler up on the YouTube channel sometime the next day or two to talk about the signing day, but I wanted to get an article up, talk about my thoughts and sort of what I think about Billy Napier's first recruiting signing class here now that National Signing Day is concluded. Just a reminder, if you want to get commercial-free episodes of Stand Up and Holler, bonus episodes of Stand Up and Holler, and then some additional writing from me, you can go over to our Patreon channel, so patreon.com/readandreaction. For about $2 a month, you can get those extra Stand Up and Holler episodes. And we're going to be doing more and more exclusive content throughout the offseason, and then also into 2022 as we go into that Billy Napier's first season as Florida Gators head coach. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get to the article. It's titled Signing Day Recap. After high profile misses, Napier has to get to work on 2023. There's no doubt that National Signing Day was disappointing for Billy Napier and Gators fans. There's also no shame in saying that. One of the things that concerned me about the Dan Mullen era was the attitude that it was okay losing on the recruiting trail and relying on strictly coaching acumen to overcome the deficit. I actually think Mullen was uniquely suited to try that experiment, but as we found out in 2021, it was a flawed experiment. Billy Napier has said all the right things since coming to campus. He immediately showed results, breaking the IMG curse with Kamari Wilson, bringing in Devin Moore from Naples, and convincing Shamar James to reconsider the Gators after decommitting earlier in the process. All of that set the stage for what could have been a huge signing day. After the early signing period, you'd excuse Florida fans for thinking that Napier had a magic spell over recruits. And for Napier, it was an opportunity to answer every question any Gator fan had about him and his ability on the recruiting trail. As it turns out, proximity and relationships matter. Only 6 of the 17 signees are from the state of Florida, which just isn't sustainable over the long haul. Part of that is due to the Mullen regime leaving Napier in a tough situation. But some of it is that Napier didn't close the deal with the few recruits he did have a shot at. That doesn't mean Napier's going to be a failure or that this class won't eventually be looked at as successful. But it does suggest that there's still work to do and that there are still open questions about Napier's ability to compete with the big boys on the recruiting trail. Those questions are going to be answered by August or September this year when we see what he's been able to put together for the 2023 class. There are some good players coming to Gainesville from 2022's class, but it could have been a haul of top-level talent. Instead, an opportunity to answer the key question about Napier was missed. It's okay to acknowledge these two truths. Napier still has time to answer that question, but it's disappointing he didn't answer it right away on Wednesday. The stats. I've taken to showing this chart a lot recently. The reason is that it exemplifies the value that comes with elite recruits and how that value tails off when you get out further into the low 4-star and high 3-star realm. So the chart is on the x-axis is recruiting ranking, the 24/7 sports composite, and on the y-axis is percent drafted by the NFL. And what you see is that recruits ranked 1 through 15 get drafted about 75% of the time. That drops to just below 60% for recruits 16 through 30, down to below 50% for recruits ranked 31 to 45, and then down to about 30% for recruits ranked 46 to 60. From recruits from about 60 to about 200, it's somewhere in the 20% range that recruits are drafted. And then it's a little bit more scattered after that, but it's probably down in like the 15% range for everybody 200 out to, and I've even done this a little bit further out in some other examples here out to the 500 space. So I think the reason for this is pretty simple. It's really easy to evaluate Walter Nolan, the #1 player overall, and see that he's special. It's a lot harder to differentiate the skills between a guy like Jack Pyburn, number 441, and Caleb Douglas, number 470. A good example of this is defensive lineman Jamari Lyons. 24 Sports has him ranked 373rd in their composite ranking, which is a meshing of multiple rankings, but has him ranked 230th in their own rankings. That means there's a large spread for each of the ranking sites when looking at Lyons' potential, indicating more uncertainty around what Lyons will eventually turn into than someone like Harold Perkins, who's 8th in the composite and 5th for the 24/7 ranking. I know most sites break kids into 5, 4, and 3-star rankings, but I think it makes more sense to break them into zones based on the data instead of what I consider arbitrary star rankings. Zone 1 consists of the first 60 players in the rankings. These players get drafted at a much higher rate than any of the others, and so I think it makes sense to break them out into a separate category. What this means is that someone like Kamari Wilson dropping from 27th to 43rd doesn't really change this analysis. We should still expect him to be good. Zone 2 consists of players ranked 61 to 200. These guys get drafted at a rate higher than Zone 3, which is 201 to 600, but it isn't a ton higher. Having these guys is valuable, but you can probably get away with loading up on Zone 3 if you have a bunch of Zone 1 players. So if we look at the 2022 recruiting class broken down by zones, it really sort of breaks down. You've got Texas A&M ranked number 1 with 10 in Zone 1, 10 in Zone 2, and 8 in Zone 3. And you can calculate the number of draftable players based on the number of players in these zones. And so Texas A&M would expect to have 8.7 guys drafted from this particular class. Alabama and Georgia follow closely behind that with 7.8 and 7.3. LSU has 3 Zone 1s, 3 Zone 2s, 6 Zone 3s. So they would expect about 3 players drafted. Kentucky and Missouri and Miami would expect around 2.5 players drafted. And then you've got Tennessee, Auburn, and Florida with about 2 players drafted. And interestingly, Florida State, now with Mike Norvell here, multiple recruiting classes in, at 2.5 players drafted, down below Florida, Auburn, and Tennessee. That's a really bad sign for Florida State. So in this context, looking at Florida's class shows that the Gators aren't too far behind the teams just in front of them by traditional rankings. So the draftable players was calculated by assuming a 50%, 25%, and 15% draft rate for Zone 1, 2, and 3 players respectively. The first thing to notice is that A&M, Alabama, and Georgia are in another league altogether. That's the goal and where Billy Napier needs to get to, but it was always unfair to compare him to those classes with a program in transition. The more interesting data points are the LSU and Miami classes. Both of those programs are transitioning, and both Brian Kelly and Mario Cristobal grade out slightly better than Napier. But this actually explains the disappointment from today, as a Perkins flip from LSU to UF would have closed that advantage for the Tigers to 0.3 draftable players, so essentially a wash. But that's the game. You need those difference makers to push your program forward. Comparison to previous transition classes. Based on traditional metrics, Napier's transition class falls right between Jim McElwain's 2015 class and Dan Mullen's 2018 transition class. That's not a great place to be. But what about if we use the zone approach to analyze those classes? Well, in this case, Jim McElwain in 2015 had 2 Zone 1 players, 1 Zone 2 player, and 4 Zone 3 players. So you would expect 1.9 or round it to 2 draftable players. Mullen had 0 Zone 1 players, 7 Zone 2 players, and 8 Zone 3 players. So you'd expect 3 players drafted from that class. And Napier in 2022 now has 1 Zone 1 player, 3 Zone 2 players, and 4 Zone 3 players. So again, we would expect 1.9, or if we round it to 2 draftable players. This makes sense if you think about it. Napier's 2022 class is ranked 19th overall, and McElwain's is ranked 21st. But this analysis really, I think, starts to gain some credibility when you start looking at the numbers and the players who were drafted. The prediction is McElwain would have 1.9 players drafted from the players ranked in the top 600 in this class. That's exactly right, as Jordan Scarlett and Antonio Callaway were the only 2 drafted. Jabari Zuniga was drafted as well, but he was rated at 636 and so falls outside of these parameters. So what about Mullen's class? It's hard to tell given that much of the class hasn't moved on to the NFL yet. Kyle Pitts is the obvious standout here. I suspect Dameon Pierce is going to be a late round pick this year, and then either Jacob Copeland or Richard Garage will get drafted as well. So again, the analysis seems to hold. So what we should expect from this transition class is 2 players who end up being drafted into the NFL. I've written previously about how Napier needs to get 2 all-SEC players out of this class to follow a championship path. That means just being NFL draftable, though, isn't going to be enough. He needs 2 stars. Takeaway. The sky isn't falling on the Florida program. This is a solid recruiting class, and Harold Perkins, Jacoby Matthews, and Trevante Citizen would have been some bells and whistles. In general, I'm much more concerned about process than I am results. If a solid process is in place, the results will eventually take hold. By all accounts, Napier is spending a considerable amount of energy making sure the right processes are in place, and I do think that will pay off down the road. For example, at his press conference, he said he was focusing on the 2022 class and fitting in the 2023 class around those prospects. But that isn't completely true. He has definitely focused energy on building relationships with local high school coaches. I suspect he's also spent a bunch of time meeting with supporters of the program. It isn't a coincidence that he's mentioned the Gator Collective at every stop today. Napier took over a program reeling from Mullen, especially on the recruiting front. The fact that Mullen had allowed Florida players to leave the state meant that Napier didn't have the same advantages that Brian Kelly had. Say what you will about Ed Orgeron, but the state of Louisiana was his in recruiting, and that's a situation that Kelly inherited and took advantage of. There's also a track record for Napier that we should pay attention to. When he took over at Louisiana, his first recruiting class ranked 105th nationally and 5th in the Sun Belt. That was worse than the average of his predecessor, 98th and 4th. But in his second or bump class, Napier improved the national ranking to 77th and had the best recruiting class in the Sun Belt for the next 3 years. That is a must for Florida. The thing that did Dan Mullen in wasn't his transition class. It was that he only increased the number of draftable players to 2.9 in his second class. That actually drops to 2.2 if you factor in that Chris Steele and Jalen Jones left the program before fall camp. It's not a coincidence that Kyrie Elam is the only surefire draft pick out of that class. There were going to be a limited number of players from that class going to the pros just based on the numbers. So what that means is that Billy Napier set a foundation pretty similar to the last two Florida coaches. It also means that Florida fell further behind Texas A&M, Alabama, and Georgia. I'm not throwing a parade for these results, but given some of the limitations, I'm also not ready to raise alarm. But as I mentioned, Mullen's numbers predicted 2.2 draftable players in his second class. Jim McElwain's numbers predicted 3.9. Tyree Cleveland, Freddie Swain, C.D. Deuce, and LaMichael Pirine were the draftees. Urban Meyer's 2006 class numbers predicted 5.7. And there you had 6: Marcus Gilbert, Percy Harvin, Tim Tebow, Brandon Spikes, Jermaine Cunningham, and Riley Cooper. That class had 4 Zone 1 players, 13 Zone 2 players, and 3 Zone 3 players. It was the second-ranked class nationally. It was a transformative class for Florida, and quite honestly, the SEC as a whole. The 2005 Georgia Bulldogs are the last team to win an SEC championship without a top 5 class in the 4 years prior to the title. Recruiting has only gotten more cutthroat since then. Urban Meyer's 2005 class finished 12th, but 3rd in the SEC. To finish 3rd in the SEC this year would have required finishing 3rd nationally. That's the expectation for Billy Napier in 2023 and moving forward. He said himself that this is a talent acquisition business. With the limitations inherent in a transition class, he deserves the benefit of the doubt. But come 2023, it's top 3 or bust. Thanks so much for joining me here. That's just a short recap as to what I think of the transition class here for Billy Napier. As I said, I still have a lot of faith in Napier and the process that he's putting in place, but it's going to be put up or shut up time when it comes to 2023. And I look forward to walking through that with all of you. So I very, very much appreciate everybody's support. Again, if you want to get more content from us, you can head over to readandreaction.com and actually check out the articles, or you can go to patreon.com/readandreaction. Help us out there. Help support what we're doing here. We very, very much appreciate it. Thanks so much. Have a good night.